Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from Whitechapel District, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the winter of 1887, the residents of Whitechapel District, a small industrial enclave on the outskirts of Boston, began to notice something unsettling about the widow Cordelia Ashworth. Mrs. Ashworth, aged 43, had been living alone in the imposing Georgian manor at the corner of Bleecker and Mansfield Streets since her husband's death from consumption 3 years prior. The house, built in 1834 by textile magnate Jeremiah Ashworth, stood as one of the district's most prominent residences, its red brick facade and tall windows overlooking the cobblestone streets where factory workers hurried to their shifts each morning. What made the neighbors uneasy was not Mrs. Ashworth's reclusiveness. Widow's grief was understood and respected in those times. Rather, it was the sounds that began emanating from the house during the late evening hours. Residents of nearby dwellings reported hearing what could only be described as mechanical, rhythmic tapping, accompanied by low humming that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Mrs. Eugenia Blackwell, who lived directly across the street, would later tell investigators that the sounds reminded her of the textile looms from her childhood, but slower, more deliberate, and somehow wrong. The official records from the Whitechapel District Police Department, archived in the Massachusetts State Historical Society, provide a skeletal framework of the events that followed. However, it was not until 1963 when Harvard medical historian Dr. Phineas Whitmore began researching Victorian-era medical practices in Massachusetts that the full scope of what occurred in that house began to emerge. Dr. Whitmore's investigation, cut short by his sudden death in 1964, left behind a collection of notes and documents that would remain sealed in university archives until they were accidentally discovered during a library renovation in 1967. To understand what happened to Cordelia Ashworth, one must first understand the woman she was before her husband's death transformed her into something else entirely. Born Cordelia Pembroke in 1844 in Salem, she came from a family of modest means but considerable intelligence. Her father, a clerk at the local courthouse, had invested heavily in his daughter's education, an unusual decision for the time. Cordelia displayed an exceptional aptitude for natural sciences and had actually served as an unofficial assistant to Dr. Lysander Hayes, Salem's most respected physician, before her marriage to Jeremiah Ashworth in 1865. The marriage had been one of mutual affection, rather than mere economic convenience. Jeremiah Ashworth, despite being 15 years her senior, recognized and encouraged his wife's intellectual pursuits. He had even commissioned the construction of a private study for her on the third floor of their Whitechapel home, complete with medical texts, a microscope imported from Germany, and a collection of anatomical specimens preserved in glass jars. Neighbors recall seeing Mrs. Ashworth tending to a small garden behind the house where she cultivated various medicinal herbs and plants, many of which were not native to Massachusetts. The couple remained childless throughout their 22-year marriage, a circumstance that Mrs. Ashworth seemed to accept with philosophical resignation. In letters discovered among her possessions, she wrote to her sister in Salem, "Jeremiah and I have found purpose in other pursuits. While I may not have been blessed with children of my own, I have been granted the gift of healing others. Dr. Hayes says my understanding of human anatomy rivals that of many university-trained physicians. Perhaps this is my true calling." When Jeremiah succumbed to consumption in October 1884, those who knew Cordelia expected her to return to her family in Salem, or perhaps seek companionship among the other widows of Whitechapel District. Instead, she retreated into the Georgian manor and began what neighbors initially assumed was an extended period of mourning. The first sign that her grief had taken an unusual turn came in early 1885, when she began ordering large quantities of medical supplies from suppliers in Boston and New York. Dr. Mortimer Blackthorne, the district's physician, recalled being approached by Mrs. Ashworth in February of 1885 with a request that struck him as highly irregular. She wanted to purchase surgical instruments and chemical preservatives, claiming she intended to continue her deceased husband's research. When pressed for details, she became evasive, mentioning only that Jeremiah had been conducting important studies related to the preservation of human tissue. This claim puzzled Dr. Blackthorne, as he had known Jeremiah Ashworth to be a successful textile manufacturer with no apparent interest in medical matters. However, Mrs. Ashworth produced a letter, apparently written in her husband's hand, authorizing the continuation of his anatomical investigations and designating her as his successor in these endeavors. The letter, dated just days before Jeremiah's death, granted her access to all his research materials and urged her to complete the work we began together in the lower chambers. The reference to lower chambers would prove significant in later investigations. The Ashworth mansion had been built with an unusually extensive basement system, originally designed to house machinery related to Jeremiah's textile business. However, municipal records from the 1870s show that substantial modifications were made to these underground rooms, including the installation of specialized ventilation systems and what appeared to be examination tables made of metal rather than wood. Mrs. Ashworth's orders for medical supplies escalated throughout 1885 and 1886. Invoices discovered in the Harvard archives show purchases of surgical saws, bone drills, preservation chemicals, glass containers of various sizes, and, most unusually, a mechanical device described only as a rhythmic percussion apparatus manufactured by a company in Philadelphia that specialized in experimental medical equipment. It was around this time that the strange sounds began emanating from the house. Mrs. Blackwell, the neighbor across the street, maintained detailed diary entries that provide a chilling chronology of the disturbances. Her first entry regarding the matter, dated November 15, 1886, reads, "The sounds from the Ashworth house have grown more frequent. Tonight I was awakened by what I can only describe as systematic tapping, as if someone were testing the resonance of various surfaces. The rhythm never varied. 3 quick taps, followed by 2 slower ones, then a pause, then the pattern repeated. This continued for nearly 2 hours. By December of 1886, other neighbors began reporting similar disturbances, along with observations that troubled them even more than the sounds. Mrs. Ashworth had begun receiving visitors late at night, men who arrived on foot, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats, carrying what appeared to be large bundles wrapped in cloth. These visitors never arrived through the front entrance, but instead used a narrow alley that led to a basement door on the side of the house. Mr. Aldrich Pemberton, who operated a small grocery store on Mansfield Street, kept meticulous records of his customers' purchases. His ledgers show that throughout 1886, Mrs. Ashworth's orders included increasingly unusual items: large quantities of ice, delivered weekly regardless of season, industrial-grade acids and alkalis, rubber sheeting, and dozens of metal containers ranging in size from small specimen jars to containers large enough to hold. Substantial organic matter. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was particularly harsh, with snow remaining on the ground from December through March. It was during this period that residents noted something deeply unsettling about the Ashworth property. While every other house in the district showed the typical signs of winter occupation: smoke from chimneys, occasional footprints in the snow leading to front doors, the warm glow of lights in windows during evening hours, the Ashworth house seemed to generate its own microclimate. The snow on the roof melted in unusual patterns, creating bare patches that formed geometric designs. The windows on the upper floors remained dark night after night, while the basement windows, barely visible at ground level, emanated a faint reddish glow that pulsed in rhythm with the mechanical sounds that had become a nightly occurrence. Most disturbing of all, the snow directly around the house never seemed to accumulate properly. Instead of the clean, white drifts that formed around other buildings, the area immediately surrounding the Ashworth mansion was marked by discolored patches where the snow took on a yellowish or grayish hue. Dr. Blackthorne, growing increasingly concerned about the reports from his patients regarding sleepless nights and inexplicable anxiety among district residents, decided to pay Mrs. Ashworth a professional visit in February of 1887. His account of this visit, preserved in his personal medical journal, provides one of the few first-hand descriptions of the house's interior during this period. I called upon Mrs. Ashworth yesterday afternoon, ostensibly to inquire about her health, but truthfully to investigate the complaints I have been receiving from her neighbors, Dr. Blackthorne wrote. She received me in the front parlor, which appeared normal in every respect save for a penetrating chemical odor that reminded me of the anatomy laboratories from my medical school days. Mrs. Ashworth herself appeared gaunt but alert, her movements precise and deliberate. When I inquired about her activities, she spoke with enthusiasm about her research into the mechanisms of human preservation and reanimation. Dr. Blackthorne's journal continues, "When I pressed her for details about this research, she led me to her husband's former study, which had been transformed into something resembling a medical library. The walls were lined with books on anatomy, physiology, and what appeared to be texts on experimental surgical procedures. Most unsettling were the detailed anatomical drawings posted throughout the room, not the standard medical illustrations one might expect, but incredibly precise sketches showing cross-sections of human organs, skeletal structures, and nervous system pathways. The quality of these drawings suggested not merely academic study, but intimate, hands-on familiarity with their subjects." The doctor's visit was cut short when Mrs. Ashworth received a delivery that required her immediate attention. As Dr. Blackthorne prepared to leave, he observed the delivery men carrying several large containers through the front door and toward what he assumed was the basement entrance. The containers, he noted, were the type typically used by medical schools for transporting anatomical specimens. As I departed, Dr. Blackthorne recorded, "Mrs. Ashworth thanked me for my visit and mentioned that she would soon be ready to share her research findings with the medical community. She spoke of having developed techniques for tissue preservation that exceeded anything currently known to science, and hinted at discoveries regarding the electrical properties of nervous tissue that would revolutionize our understanding of the boundary between life and death." Her eyes held a fervor that might be attributed to widow's grief, but I fear it may be something more troubling. The events that followed Dr. Blackthorne's visit suggest that Mrs. Ashworth may have interpreted his inquiries as a sign that her work was attracting unwanted attention. Neighbors reported that the nighttime sounds ceased abruptly in late February 1887, replaced by a silence that proved even more unsettling than the previous disturbances. Mrs. Blackwell's diary entry for February 28, 1887, captures the eerie quality of this new quiet. "The Ashworth house has gone silent, but it is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of something holding its breath. No lights in any windows, no smoke from the chimneys, no footprints in the snow leading to or from the doors. Yet I have the distinct impression that the house is not empty. Sometimes, when the wind is still, I fancy I can hear a very faint sound, not the mechanical tapping we had grown accustomed to, but something like whispered conversation, as if multiple people were speaking in very low voices." This period of apparent inactivity lasted through March and into April of 1887. However, careful observation by neighbors revealed subtle signs that the house remained occupied. Fresh food deliveries continued to arrive, though they were collected immediately, and the deliverymen reported never seeing Mrs. Ashworth directly. The basement windows continued to emit their faint, pulsing glow during evening hours, though the light was now barely perceptible and only visible to observers positioned at specific angles. On April 15, 1887, Mrs. Ashworth broke her self-imposed isolation with an action that would later be seen as a desperate attempt to legitimize her activities. She sent a formal letter to the Massachusetts Medical Society proposing to present a paper on her research at their annual conference. The letter, preserved in the Society's archives, provides chilling insight into the scope of her work. Esteemed colleagues, the letter began, "I write to inform you of significant advances I have achieved in the field of anatomical preservation and the study of post-mortem nervous system function. Through careful experimentation over the past 3 years, I have developed techniques that allow for the maintenance of tissue viability far beyond the normal parameters of death. More significantly, I have documented electrical activity in nervous tissue that persists for extended periods under proper conditions." The letter continued, "My research suggests that what we understand as the moment of death may be merely a transition rather than a termination. Through the application of specific chemical preservatives and controlled electrical stimulation, I have observed responses in post-mortem specimens that challenge our fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and physical existence." Mrs. Ashworth concluded her proposal by offering to demonstrate her techniques before a committee of qualified physicians, stating that she had subjects readily available for examination and that her methods could be reproduced under controlled conditions. The Massachusetts Medical Society's response, dated May 2, 1887, was politely dismissive. Dr. Reginald Thorne, the Society's president, wrote, "While we appreciate your enthusiasm for medical research, the claims outlined in your proposal appear to venture into territory that lies beyond the accepted boundaries of scientific investigation. We must respectfully decline your offer to present at this year's conference." This rejection seems to have triggered the final and most disturbing phase of Mrs. Ashworth's activities. Neighbors reported that the sounds from the house resumed in early May, but with a new character that suggested desperation rather than methodical research. Instead of the previous rhythmic tapping, residents now heard irregular banging, occasional crashes, and what Mrs. Blackwell described as sounds of great exertion, as if someone were moving very heavy objects. Our Dr. Blackthorne, increasingly concerned about the psychological state of district residents, organized a group of prominent citizens to approach the local authorities about the situation. However, their efforts were complicated by the fact that Mrs. Ashworth had committed no obvious crimes and remained the legal owner of her property. The police agreed to conduct a welfare check, but only if evidence of actual criminal activity could be presented. That evidence came in the form of a discovery made by young Timothy Ashford, who delivered ice to households throughout Whitechapel district. On May 20, 1887, while making his regular delivery to the Ashworth house, Timothy noticed that the basement door, typically secured with multiple locks, had been left ajar. Curiosity overcoming caution, he peered through the opening and observed what he later described to authorities as a room full of tables, each covered with white sheets, and under the sheets, shapes that looked like people sleeping. Timothy's report prompted an immediate police investigation. Constable Marcus Thornfield and Constable James Whitmore arrived at the Ashworth house on the afternoon of May 21, 1887, with a warrant to conduct a safety inspection. Their initial report, filed that evening, was tersely worded and revealed little about what they discovered. The complete truth would not emerge until Dr. Phineas Whitmore's research in the 1960s uncovered the full investigative files. According to these documents, the police found Mrs. Ashworth in her basement laboratory, calmly working at a table surrounded by an array of anatomical specimens, surgical instruments, and electrical apparatus, unlike anything they had seen before. She showed no surprise at their arrival and invited them to observe her work, speaking with the enthusiasm of a researcher eager to share her discoveries with colleagues. The basement had been divided into several interconnected rooms, each serving a specific function in what appeared to be a comprehensive system for the acquisition, preparation, and study of human remains. The first room contained a series of metal tables, each equipped with restraints and connected to a complex network of tubes and electrical wires. The second room housed dozens of glass containers filled with preservative solutions, many containing organs and tissue samples in various stages of what Mrs. Ashworth termed sustained animation. The third and largest room served as her primary laboratory, containing the mechanical apparatus that had generated the sounds disturbing her neighbors for months. The device, roughly the size of a small carriage, consisted of a series of precisely calibrated hammers and percussion instruments designed to deliver specific rhythmic impacts to specimens under study. Mrs. Ashworth explained that she had discovered that certain patterns of mechanical stimulation could elicit responses from nervous tissue even after the cessation of normal life functions. Most troubling to the investigating officers was the evidence that Mrs. Ashworth's research had progressed far beyond the study of isolated tissue samples. In the final room of her laboratory, they found 3 examination tables, each occupied by what appeared to be complete human bodies in various states of preservation. These subjects, as Mrs. Ashworth referred to them, showed signs of extensive surgical intervention with incisions, sutures, and mechanical attachments that suggested ongoing experimentation rather than simple preservation. When questioned about the source of these specimens, Mrs. Ashworth became evasive, claiming only that they had been donated to science and that all her subjects had consented to participate in research that would advance human understanding. She produced documents that appeared to be consent forms, though the signatures were shaky and the dates raised questions about when and under what circumstances the agreements had been signed. Constable Thornfield's private notes, discovered among Dr. Whitmore's research materials, provide a more visceral account of the basement's contents. What we found in that place defies description in official reports. The woman had created a factory for death, but worse than death, for the prolongation of something that should have been allowed to end naturally. The sounds the neighbors had been hearing were not just mechanical devices, but responses from her subjects to the stimulation she was providing. I observed one specimen whose eyes tracked movement and whose fingers responded to touch, despite being clearly deceased and partially dissected. The investigation revealed that Mrs. Ashworth had been acquiring her research subjects through a network of contacts in Boston's poorer districts, individuals whose disappearances would be unlikely to prompt extensive investigation. She had apparently posed as a physician offering free medical treatment to vagrants, elderly persons without family, and those suffering from terminal illnesses. Once in her care, these individuals became participants in her research, with their consent obtained through means that the documents suggest involved coercion and possibly chemical persuasion. The extent of Mrs. Ashworth's activities became clear when investigators discovered her meticulously kept research journals. These documents, spanning the 3 years since her husband's death, detailed her progression from simple anatomical study to increasingly complex experiments in what she termed transmortem consciousness preservation. Her early entries focused on developing preservation techniques that maintained tissue integrity for extended periods. Later entries described attempts to sustain nerve function and electrical activity in recently deceased subjects. The final entries, written in the weeks before her arrest, suggested that Mrs. Ashworth believed she had achieved a breakthrough in maintaining consciousness after clinical death. She wrote of subjects who could respond to questions through predetermined signals, who appeared to retain memories and personality traits, and who demonstrated what she interpreted as evidence of continued mental activity despite the absence of heartbeat or respiration. May 15, 1887, read one of her final journal entries. Subject 7 continues to demonstrate remarkable retention of pre-mortem cognitive function. When presented with personal items from his former life, he responds with appropriate emotional indicators. Most significantly, when I recreated the rhythm of a song he claimed to enjoy during intake interviews, his preserved nervous system generated electrical patterns consistent with recognition and positive emotional response. I am convinced that I have isolated the mechanisms by which consciousness persists beyond physical death. Mrs. Ashworth's research ended abruptly with her arrest on May 21, 1887. However, the legal proceedings that followed were complicated by questions about her mental competency and the unprecedented nature of her alleged crimes. The district attorney, faced with evidence of activities that fell outside existing criminal statutes, initially charged her with grave robbery and illegal medical practice, though these charges hardly addressed the scope of what investigators had discovered. The trial, held in September 1887, was closed to the public at the request of both the prosecution and defense, who agreed that the details of Mrs. Ashworth's research were too disturbing for general consumption. The few court records that survive suggest that Mrs. Ashworth mounted a defense based on scientific necessity, arguing that her work represented legitimate medical research that would ultimately benefit humanity. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, the psychiatrist appointed to evaluate Mrs. Ashworth's mental state, concluded that while she showed clear signs of obsessive behavior and moral detachment, she remained intellectually coherent and aware of her actions. His report noted that she continued to speak about her research with clinical detachment, showing no remorse for the suffering she had caused, but genuine puzzlement at society's unwillingness to acknowledge the value of her discoveries. The fate of Mrs. Ashworth's research subjects became a matter of considerable debate during the trial. While some specimens were clearly deceased and beyond any possibility of recovery, others displayed signs of what Mrs. Ashworth insisted was continued consciousness, despite the absence of normal vital signs. Medical experts called to examine these subjects disagreed about their condition, with some arguing that observed responses were merely reflexive actions of preserved nervous tissue, while others admitted they could not explain the complexity and appropriateness of the reactions they witnessed. Ultimately, the decision was made to end Mrs. Ashworth's experiments immediately, regardless of the subject's condition. This decision was justified on ethical grounds, though private correspondence between officials suggests that some harbored concerns about whether they were effectively ending lives that, by Mrs. Ashworth's definition, continued to exist. Mrs. Ashworth was committed to the Danvers State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in October 1887, where she remained until her death in 1902. Hospital records indicate that she spent her confinement years attempting to continue her research in limited ways, using whatever materials she could acquire within the institution's constraints. She reportedly continued to insist that her work had achieved breakthrough discoveries that society was not ready to accept. The Ashworth mansion was sealed by court order immediately following the trial, with instructions that it remain closed until all contaminated materials could be safely disposed of. However, this process proved more complicated than anticipated, as many of Mrs. Ashworth's chemical preservation solutions had unknown properties that made standard disposal methods potentially dangerous. A team of chemists from Harvard University was contracted to oversee the cleanup, but their work was hampered by the discovery that some of Mrs. Ashworth's specimens continued to exhibit signs of preservation that exceeded normal scientific understanding. Dr. Cornelius Blackthorne, son of the district physician and a member of the cleanup team, noted in his private journals that several subjects maintained tissue elasticity and cellular integrity that suggested ongoing biological processes, despite the absence of circulation or respiration. The cleanup team's work was further complicated by equipment that appeared to function according to principles they could not entirely comprehend. Miss Ashworth's electrical apparatus generated effects that seemed to exceed the capabilities of available technology, leading some team members to speculate that she had discovered techniques or principles not yet recognized by conventional science. Dr. Blackthorne's journals, discovered among his papers after his death in 1923, provide disturbing insights into the cleanup process. We have been working in that basement for 3 weeks now, and I confess that the experience has shaken my confidence in our understanding of life and death. Some of Mrs. Ashworth's subjects continue to respond to stimuli in ways that suggest awareness, despite having been clinically dead for months. When we disconnect her electrical apparatus, the responses cease, but when we reconnect the devices, the subjects appear to reawaken in some sense. Most troubling is our inability to explain how her preservation techniques maintain tissue integrity for such extended periods. We have attempted to replicate her methods using the formulas found in her journals, but our results fall far short of what she achieved. There appears to be some element of her process that she never recorded, some technique or ingredient that died with her sanity. The cleanup was finally completed in December 1887, with all specimens and equipment being transported to a secured facility operated by Harvard University. However, Dr. Blackthorne's journals suggest that the disposal process was not entirely successful. Several specimens were reported as having been lost in transit, and some of Mrs. Ashworth's more complex apparatus disappeared during the transfer process. In the years following the trial, several members of the cleanup team experienced health problems and psychological difficulties that their colleagues attributed to prolonged exposure to Mrs. Ashworth's chemical preservatives. Dr. Blackthorne himself developed a nervous condition characterized by insomnia and paranoid delusions about being watched by unseen observers. His journals from this period make frequent references to sounds reminiscent of Mrs. Ashworth's mechanical apparatus, which he heard in his own home, despite having no equipment that could generate such sounds. The Ashworth mansion remained vacant for several years after the cleanup, as potential buyers were deterred by the property's reputation. When it was finally sold in 1892, the new owners reported strange occurrences that echoed earlier complaints from neighbors: mechanical sounds during nighttime hours, unusual odors emanating from the basement area, and electrical phenomena that could not be explained by the house's wiring system. These problems persisted through several changes of ownership until 1903, when the building was purchased by the Catholic Church and converted into a convent. The nuns reported that extensive renovation and consecration seemed to eliminate the disturbing phenomena, though they noted that the basement areas remained perpetually cold and that electronics installed in those spaces frequently malfunctioned. Dr. Phineas Whitmore's investigation into the Ashworth case began in 1963 as part of a broader study of Victorian-era medical practices in Massachusetts. His initial interest was purely academic, focused on documenting the historical development of surgical techniques and anatomical study during the late 19th century. However, as he delved deeper into archived records, he began to uncover references to Mrs. Ashworth's work that suggested her activities had been far more sophisticated and successful than official records indicated. Dr. Whitmore's breakthrough came when he discovered a cache of documents that had been misfiled in the Harvard Medical School archives. These papers, apparently overlooked during previous organizational efforts, contained detailed correspondence between Mrs. Ashworth and several prominent physicians of her era, including some who had achieved international recognition for their contributions to medical science. The correspondence revealed that Mrs. Ashworth's research had attracted attention from the highest levels of the medical establishment, with several respected figures expressing private interest in her techniques while maintaining public distance from her methods. Dr. Wilhelm Braun of Johns Hopkins, considered one of the leading anatomists of his generation, wrote to Mrs. Ashworth in April 1887, "Your recent letter describing your preservation methods has captured my imagination in ways that I find both thrilling and deeply troubling. If your claims are accurate, you have achieved results that challenge our fundamental understanding of biological death." Dr. Braun's letter continued, "I must urge extreme caution in how you proceed with this research, as the implications extend far beyond medical science into theological and philosophical realms that society is not prepared to confront. However, I confess that my scientific curiosity compels me to request additional details about your electrical stimulation techniques and the chemical compositions you have developed." Similar correspondence from other prominent physicians suggested that Mrs. Ashworth's work was viewed as potentially revolutionary by those qualified to evaluate its scientific merit, even as they recognized the ethical and social problems it created. Dr. Marcus Finch of Massachusetts General Hospital wrote, "Your research represents either the greatest advancement in medical science since Harvey's description of circulation, or the most dangerous deviation from ethical medical practice in recorded history. I suspect it may be both simultaneously." Dr. Whitmore's investigation revealed that several of Mrs. Ashworth's correspondents had attempted to replicate her techniques using the information she provided in their letters. These experiments, conducted in secret at various medical institutions, had achieved limited success in tissue preservation, but failed to reproduce the more dramatic effects she claimed to have observed. Dr. Braun's private laboratory notes, discovered among his papers after his death, documented his attempts to recreate Mrs. Ashworth's electrical stimulation methods. Using the specifications provided by C.A., I've constructed a scaled-down version of her percussion apparatus. Initial trials with recently deceased laboratory animals have produced responses that exceed normal post-mortem reflexes. Muscle contractions persist for hours after clinical death, and nervous system monitoring indicates electrical activity patterns that resemble those observed in living subjects. However, Dr. Braun also noted significant limitations in his replication efforts. "While I have achieved some success with her basic techniques, I cannot replicate the extended preservation periods or complex behavioral responses she describes. There appears to be some crucial element missing from her documented procedures, perhaps a chemical compound or electrical configuration that she chose not to share in our correspondence." Dr. Whitmore's most significant discovery was a final letter from Mrs. Ashworth to Dr. Braun, dated just days before her arrest. This letter, more personal in tone than their previous correspondence, provided insights into her mental state during the final phase of her research. "My dear colleague," the letter began, "I write to inform you that my work has progressed beyond the preliminary stages we discussed. I have achieved sustained consciousness preservation in multiple subjects for periods exceeding 3 months. More significantly, I have documented evidence of enhanced cognitive function in some subjects, suggesting that the transition beyond physical death may actually augment certain mental capabilities." The letter continued with descriptions that Dr. Whitmore found deeply disturbing. Subject 4, a vagrant who expired under my care in February, continues to demonstrate problem-solving abilities that exceed his pre-mortem intellectual capacity. When presented with mathematical puzzles, he provides solutions using methods that he could not have known during his lifetime. I believe that the preservation process may allow access to knowledge or capabilities that are normally constrained by the limitations of living brain tissue. Mrs. Ashworth concluded this letter with a statement that would haunt Dr. Whitmore's research. "I have come to realize that what we call death may be merely the beginning of a higher form of existence, one in which consciousness is freed from the biological constraints that limit human potential. My subjects are not victims of my research. They are pioneers in humanity's next evolutionary step. Dr. Whitmore's attempts to verify the contents of Mrs. Ashworth's final letter led him to examine records from other medical institutions where her correspondents had worked. At Johns Hopkins, he discovered that Dr. Braun's laboratory had been closed abruptly in late 1887, with all research materials being transferred to secured storage. The official explanation cited concerns about infectious disease contamination, but private memos suggested that the closure was motivated by discoveries that administrators considered too dangerous for continued study. Similar patterns emerged at Massachusetts General Hospital and the University of Pennsylvania, where research programs that had been investigating tissue preservation techniques were terminated without explanation during the same period. Dr. Whitmore began to suspect that Mrs. Ashworth's work had influenced a broader network of researchers who had been forced to abandon their investigations due to pressures from medical and academic authorities. The scope of this potential conspiracy became clearer when Dr. Whitmore discovered references to a secret conference held in Philadelphia in November 1887, just weeks after Mrs. Ashworth's trial. The conference, organized by Dr. Finch and attended by several physicians who had corresponded with Mrs. Ashworth, was apparently convened to discuss the implications of her research and develop a coordinated response to public concerns about similar investigations. Minutes from this conference, found among Dr. Finch's papers, reveal that the assembled physicians had reached a consensus that Mrs. Ashworth's techniques, while scientifically valid, posed threats to social order that outweighed their medical potential. Dr. Finch wrote, "We are unanimous in our conclusion that CA's methods, regardless of their scientific merit, cannot be pursued under current social and legal frameworks. The implications of consciousness preservation extend far beyond medicine into questions of human identity, legal death, and the nature of existence itself." The conference participants agreed to suppress their research into similar techniques and to discourage other researchers from pursuing related investigations. However, the minutes also suggest that some attendees harbored intentions to continue their work in more discreet ways. While we acknowledge the necessity of public prohibition, several colleagues have expressed interest in maintaining private research programs that might advance our understanding while avoiding the ethical complications that befell CA's more dramatic experiments. Dr. Whitmore's investigation took a disturbing turn when he attempted to locate the facilities where Mrs. Ashworth's specimens and equipment had reportedly been stored after the cleanup of her laboratory. Harvard University's records indicated that all materials had been transferred to a secured research facility in western Massachusetts, but subsequent inquiries revealed that the facility's records from that period had been destroyed in a fire in 1903. Further investigation revealed that several other storage facilities that had housed materials from Mrs. Ashworth's laboratory had also experienced fires, floods, or other disasters that resulted in the destruction of their contents. The pattern of these incidents raised questions about whether the destruction of evidence had been deliberate rather than accidental. Dr. Whitmore's suspicions were strengthened when he discovered that several researchers who had been involved in the original cleanup or subsequent storage of Mrs. Ashworth's materials had died under unusual circumstances. Dr. Cornelius Blackthorne, whose journals had provided valuable insights into the cleanup process, had died in his laboratory under conditions that investigators described as consistent with exposure to unknown chemical agents. Two other cleanup team members had suffered similar fates within a year of completing their work. These deaths, while officially attributed to occupational hazards associated with handling dangerous chemicals, followed patterns that suggested deliberate elimination of individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's techniques. Dr. Whitmore began to suspect that forces within the medical establishment were actively working to suppress not only the research itself, but also anyone who could provide evidence of its success. Dr. Whitmore's investigation came to an abrupt end in February 1964, when he was found dead in his Harvard office under circumstances that paralleled the deaths of researchers connected to the original Ashworth case. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but colleagues noted that Dr. Whitmore had been in excellent health and had shown no signs of cardiac problems. More troubling was the discovery that Dr. Whitmore's research materials had been removed from his office before his body was found. All of his notes, photocopied documents, and correspondence related to the Ashworth case had vanished, leaving only his routine academic papers and unrelated research. The individuals who discovered his body reported that his office showed signs of having been systematically searched, with filing cabinets left open and papers scattered across the floor. The investigation into Dr. Whitmore's death was conducted perfunctorily, with authorities concluding that he had suffered a heart attack and that any missing materials had been routine academic papers with no particular value. However, his research assistant, Miss Cordelia Whitfield, privately maintained that Dr. Whitmore had been in the process of preparing a comprehensive report on the Ashworth case that would have revealed the full extent of the conspiracy to suppress knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's discoveries. Miss Whitfield, concerned about her own safety following Dr. Whitmore's death, made copies of some of his research notes before they could be confiscated. These fragments, which she hid in various locations around Cambridge, provided enough information for future researchers to reconstruct the basic outline of his investigation, though many crucial details were lost with the destruction of his complete files. The Ashworth case file was officially closed in 1964 with the conclusion that Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth had been a delusional widow whose grief had led her to commit criminal acts while believing she was conducting legitimate medical research. This conclusion, while convenient for administrative purposes, ignored the substantial evidence that her techniques had achieved results that conventional science could not explain. In the years following Dr. Whitmore's death, several attempts were made by other researchers to investigate the Ashworth case, but these efforts were consistently frustrated by missing documentation, restricted access to archived materials, and institutional pressures that discouraged inquiry into the subject. The case gradually faded from academic discussion, becoming merely a footnote in studies of Victorian-era medical ethics. However, the influence of Mrs. Ashworth's work may have persisted in ways that official records do not acknowledge. Several medical innovations that emerged in the decades following her death bore striking similarities to techniques described in her correspondence, suggesting that some of her methods may have been adopted by mainstream medicine without acknowledgement of their origin. The development of modern organ preservation techniques, electrical stimulation therapies, and advanced life support systems all showed characteristics that paralleled Mrs. Ashworth's documented procedures, though the researchers responsible for these innovations made no mention of her work in their published papers. Some medical historians have speculated that Mrs. Ashworth's research may have influenced the development of techniques that are now considered standard medical practice, but that the ethical controversies surrounding her methods necessitated the concealment of her contributions to medical science. The legacy of the Ashworth case extends beyond its immediate historical significance to raise enduring questions about the boundaries between life and death, the ethics of medical research, and the extent to which society is prepared to accept scientific discoveries that challenge fundamental assumptions about human existence. Mrs. Ashworth's conviction that consciousness could persist beyond clinical death, while dismissed by her contemporaries as the delusion of a grief-stricken mind, anticipated modern debates about brain death, persistent vegetative states, and the definition of death itself. Her techniques for tissue preservation and electrical stimulation foreshadowed contemporary research into cryonic preservation, neural interface technology, and attempts to understand the relationship between brain activity and consciousness. The conspiracy to suppress knowledge of her discoveries, if it indeed existed, as Dr. Whitmore's research suggested, raises troubling questions about the willingness of scientific and medical institutions to sacrifice potentially valuable knowledge in order to maintain social stability and professional respectability. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that Mrs. Ashworth's research succeeded to a degree that her contemporaries could not acknowledge without fundamentally altering their understanding of life, death, and human consciousness. If her claims about sustained consciousness preservation were accurate, then her conviction and imprisonment may have been motivated not by concern for her victims, but by terror at the implications of her success. The abandoned laboratory beneath the Ashworth mansion, now buried under the foundation of a convent, may have contained discoveries that could have revolutionized medical science if they had been studied rather than suppressed. The specimens that Dr. Blackthorne described as continuing to exhibit signs of awareness months after clinical death might have provided insights into consciousness, memory, and the nature of human identity that society was unprepared to accept. Today, more than a century after Mrs. Ashworth's arrest, the questions raised by her research remain unresolved. Medical science continues to struggle with definitions of death, the ethics of life extension, and the boundaries of acceptable research into human consciousness. The techniques she claimed to have developed, consciousness preservation, electrical neural stimulation, and indefinite tissue preservation, remain goals of contemporary research pursued through methods that differ mainly in their sophistication from her crude but possibly effective approach. The Whitechapel district where Mrs. Ashworth conducted her experiments has long since been absorbed into the expanding city of Boston, with most of the original buildings replaced by modern construction. The convent that replaced the Ashworth mansion was itself demolished in 1987 to make way for a medical research facility, creating an ironic continuity between the site's past and present functions. Workers who participated in the demolition of the convent reported discovering strange anomalies in the building's foundation, including areas where the concrete showed unusual discoloration and rooms that appeared to have been sealed during original construction rather than subsequent renovation. However, these observations were not formally documented, and any artifacts that may have been uncovered during the demolition were not preserved. The current occupants of the site, researchers working on cutting-edge neuroscience and consciousness studies, remain unaware of the location's connection to Mrs. Ashworth's pioneering but suppressed work. They pursue similar goals using techniques that she might have recognized, seeking to understand the mechanisms of consciousness and the possibility of preserving cognitive function beyond biological death. It is tempting to view this continuity as mere coincidence, but it might also suggest that Mrs. Ashworth's questions were inevitable ones that medical science would eventually be compelled to address, regardless of the controversies they might generate. Her methods may have been crude and ethically questionable, but her fundamental inquiry into the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical existence remains one of the most profound challenges facing contemporary science. The widow of Whitechapel district, convicted as a criminal and dismissed as a madwoman, may ultimately be remembered as a pioneer who asked the right questions at the wrong time, whose discoveries were too disturbing for her era to accept, but too important for history to ignore completely. Whether her specific techniques were as successful as she claimed may never be known, but the questions she raised about consciousness, death, and the limits of medical intervention continue to challenge researchers more than a century after her laboratory was sealed and her specimens destroyed. In the basement of a Boston medical research facility, scientists work with electrical stimulation equipment and tissue preservation techniques that would have been familiar to Cordelia Ashworth. They pursue the same goals that drove her to transform her home into a laboratory and her neighbors into unwitting witnesses to experiments that challenged the fundamental boundaries between life and death. The methods have evolved, the ethical frameworks have become more sophisticated, but the essential mystery she sought to solve remains. What is consciousness? How does it relate to physical existence? And can it persist beyond the death of the body that contains it? Perhaps Mrs. Ashworth's greatest discovery was not any specific technique for preserving life or consciousness, but the recognition that these questions could not be answered through conventional means. Her willingness to cross ethical boundaries and challenge social taboos, while ultimately destructive to herself and her victims, may have been necessary to demonstrate that consciousness preservation was possible, even if the methods required to achieve it were unacceptable to civilized society. The sounds that once emanated from her laboratory, the rhythmic mechanical tapping that kept her neighbors awake, may have been more than just the operation of crude electrical apparatus. They may have been the first tentative communications from consciousness that had been artificially sustained beyond death, primitive attempts by preserved minds to signal their continued existence to the living world that no longer recognized them as participants in human experience. If so, then the silence that followed the destruction of her laboratory was not just the end of disturbing noise, but the severing of humanity's first contact with forms of existence that transcend the biological limitations of life and death. The conspiracy to suppress knowledge of her work may have been motivated not by ethical concerns alone, but by the recognition that successful consciousness preservation would fundamentally alter human society in ways that no institution was prepared to manage. Mrs. Ashworth's victims, if her claims about their continued consciousness were accurate, may have been humanity's first pioneers into a form of existence that lies beyond our current understanding. Their preservation in her basement laboratory may have represented not torture or exploitation, but humanity's first steps toward a fundamentally different relationship with mortality. The ethical questions raised by this possibility, whether consciousness preservation justifies the means required to achieve it, whether individuals have the right to refuse existence beyond death, whether society has obligations to beings whose form of existence it does not recognize, remain unresolved because the research that might provide answers continues to be constrained by the same social and ethical concerns that ended Mrs. Ashworth's investigations. The widow of Whitechapel District may have been ahead of her time, not just in her methods, but in her willingness to confront possibilities that humanity is still not ready to accept. Her laboratory may have been the scene not just of criminal activity, but of humanity's first encounter with its own future evolution beyond the limitations of biological existence. The case remains officially closed, the evidence destroyed, the witnesses dead. But the questions Mrs. Ashworth raised continue to echo through contemporary medical research, and the techniques she pioneered continue to evolve in laboratories around the world. Perhaps her greatest achievement was not any specific discovery, but the demonstration that the boundaries between life and death are less absolute than society believes, and that consciousness may be far more resilient and adaptable than the biological systems that normally support it. In a basement laboratory beneath modern Boston, researchers continue to explore the electrical properties of neural tissue and the possibilities of consciousness preservation. They work in ignorance of their connection to Mrs. Ashworth's suppressed research, but they pursue the same fundamental goal she sought more than a century ago. Whether they will prove more successful, more ethical, or more acceptable to society remains to be seen. The sounds of mechanical apparatus Testing the responsiveness of preserved tissue may yet return to disturb the sleep of Boston residents, but this time they may announce not criminal madness, but humanity's next evolutionary step into forms of existence that transcend the traditional boundaries of life and death.